Ever noticed how Black Americans don't all look the same? Like seriously, go from New York to Louisiana to California, and you will look at entirely different people. You will see Black men with broad chests and sculpted muscles that look like they were carved by history itself. Women with radiant skin so smooth it reflects sunlight. They have jet black braided hair, golden curls, or even natural blonde. Some have piercing blue or hazel eyes, others with towering height, petite frames, or features so bold they defy all stereotypes. One minute, you see a man with skin like obsidian and a build like a warrior. The next, a woman with green eyes, light freckles, and curls that look almost Nordic. And yet, they are all Black. But how is that possible? The answer isn't just in culture, it's in the code. Because let's be honest, African American DNA isn't just diverse. It's explosive. It's been forged in slavery, mixed by force, shaped by rebellion, and sharpened by survival. It's the only DNA in America that carries the muscle of West Africa, the trauma of plantations, the fire of resistance, and the unexpected traces of European blood that was never invited in. And out of that chaos came something the world can't explain. A gene pool so dominant, it defies science and stereotypes alike. But what power does African American DNA hold that nobody talks about and is scared to mention? In this video, let's know the story of why they hide the truth and power of African American DNA. Let's get started. African American DNA begins in the richest biological archive on Earth, Africa, the birthplace of all human life. But what makes African ancestry so extraordinary isn't just that it's old, it's that it's diverse. In fact, two people from different parts of Africa may be more genetically different from each other than a European is from an East Asian. That's how much evolutionary time and adaptation has shaped this continent. The genetic diversity of Africa is unmatched, a result of humanity evolving for over 200,000 years in various climates, elevations, diets, and disease environments. The African American gene story, however, doesn't remain in Africa. It gets violently uprooted and rerouted through one of the most horrific events in human history, the transatlantic slave trade. Beginning in the 16th century and spanning over 400 years, millions of Africans were stolen, sold, and shipped across the ocean like cargo. The majority came from West and Central Africa, regions that include modern-day Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Angola, and Congo, all areas rich in genetic and cultural diversity. But what happened next forged something new and terrifyingly powerful. Once in the Americas, these Africans were stripped of their names, languages, families, and traditions, but not their DNA. That legacy could not be erased. Yet over time, it was shaped by something no less brutal: forced admixture. Many African women were sexually abused by slave owners, overseers, or soldiers. These violent encounters left a permanent mark in the gene pool, not by choice, but by force. Today, most African Americans carry between 15% and 30% European DNA, though some regions have higher or lower averages. Additionally, many African Americans also carry traces of Native American ancestry, particularly in areas like the Carolinas, Louisiana, and parts of Oklahoma, places where African and Native communities often lived side by side, sometimes marrying, sometimes surviving together. All these pieces, like African strength, European intrusion, and indigenous connection, forged a genetic variation unlike any other, one that had to endure centuries of disease, starvation, brutality, and resistance. Only the strong, physically, genetically, and spiritually, survived. That's why African American DNA is not just diverse, but resilient, a byproduct of both ancient brilliance and historical brutality. This is not just a population. This is a supergene forged in fire. While African DNA is globally the most diverse, African American DNA tells a narrower but more intense story. That's because it went through a rare and brutal genetic event called a bottleneck. In biology, a genetic bottleneck happens when a large population is suddenly reduced to a smaller group. This limits the diversity of the gene pool and means future generations will descend from a much narrower set of ancestors. The result is a compressed but often more focused range of traits. Now picture this. Tens of millions of people lived across West and Central Africa, each with distinct ethnicities, languages, and genetic profiles. Then came the slave ships. On those ships, only a few were selected from each region. Many died in transit due to disease, abuse, and dehydration. Of the ones who survived, only some reproduced in the Americas. That limited group became the foundation of what we now call the African American population. That's the bottleneck. But here's where it gets wild. While this bottleneck reduced overall genetic variation, it also concentrated certain powerful traits, especially those related to survival. Africans who survived the slave ships, forced labor, and new diseases in the Americas had to possess or develop exceptional immune systems, physical endurance, and mental resilience. Over time, traits that promoted survival, such as resistance to malaria, salt retention, and quick recovery from infections, became more prominent. These were not just inherited. They were amplified by centuries of natural selection under brutal conditions. And that's not all. Because African Americans were often prohibited from marrying who they wanted or keeping their families intact, the gene pool remained relatively closed within plantations and segregated communities. That meant certain genetic traits were passed down repeatedly, strengthening their presence across generations. The result was a genetic profile that is both compressed and enhanced, rich in ancestral memory, yet shaped by forced adaptation. It carries the pain of displacement, but also the power of survival. It is not just a tragedy, it is a testimony. And despite its complexity and importance, African American DNA remains one of the most underrepresented datasets in global genetic research. And that's a problem, not just for African Americans, but for science itself. The vast majority of genetic studies, especially those used to develop drugs and treatments, have historically been based on European DNA. This means that everything from cancer drugs to antidepressants are often less effective for people of African descent. Why? Because the blueprint they were built on doesn't include them. Yet, when African American populations are studied, the results are groundbreaking. In cancer research, African American participation has helped identify unique gene mutations in prostate cancer, a disease that hits Black men at higher rates and with greater severity. Researchers have found variations in genes like BRCA1 and BRCA2 among African American women as well, critical data in the fight against breast cancer. In cardiology, studies on African American DNA have unearthed specific variants associated with hypertension, heart disease, and strokes, conditions that disproportionately affect Black communities. Without this research, many of these risks remain invisible in standard health screenings. In diabetes research, scientists have discovered unique gene-environment interactions, showing how African American communities process insulin differently, respond to certain medications differently, and even metabolize foods in ways current nutrition science barely understands. But this is just the beginning. Powerful genes allow African Americans to have strong immune systems. According to cutting-edge research, there's a stark biological divide between African and European immune responses. This is not speculation, it's science at its most revealing. In a groundbreaking study published in Cell by researchers from the Institut Pasteur and CNRS, scientists analyzed immune responses in 200 individuals, 100 of African ancestry, 100 of European. What they found was astonishing. African immune systems are more reactive, more adaptive, and fundamentally more complex than their European counterparts, particularly in how they respond to viruses and inflammation. It's as if African DNA was built to handle a higher level of microbial warfare, and that's not far from the truth. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black Africa. Let's continue now. For millennia, African populations evolved in tropical climates, where they were constantly exposed to dangerous pathogens like malaria, yellow fever, tuberculosis, and Ebola-like viruses. To survive, their immune systems had to become hyper-aware and fast-acting, able to destroy threats before they spread. These environmental pressures shaped DNA in a way that selectively favored immunity-enhancing mutations, passing them on generation after generation. Meanwhile, Europeans evolved under a different threat, like harsh winters, plagues, and epidemics that were often less frequent but devastating when they hit. Their defense systems evolved more slowly and were shaped by a surprising source: Neanderthals. Modern Europeans inherited up to 4% of their genome from Neanderthals, including gene variants that affect immune system behavior. These Neanderthal-derived genes play a role in how Europeans respond to viral infections today, from COVID-19 to influenza. But Africans never interbred with Neanderthals. Their DNA is purely Homo sapiens, shaped not by archaic relatives, but by relentless real-world exposure to the world's deadliest diseases. That means African American DNA, which still carries much of this genetic resistance legacy, is fundamentally wired to respond faster and stronger to threats. This isn't about biological superiority. It's about biological context. Different environments sculpt different immune blueprints. But what's clear is this: African immune systems were trained on the front lines of nature, and that legacy still exists today, in the very immune cells of African Americans, many of whom carry this defensive brilliance, even if they have never set foot on African soil. Therefore, it gets established that Africa doesn't just have a rich history. It holds the richest genetic library on the planet, and African Americans inherited that. According to research from the University of Pennsylvania, which analyzed the genomes of 121 African groups and compared them to 60 non-African populations, Africa, especially West Africa, contains more genetic variation than anywhere else on Earth. Why? Because it's the birthplace of modern humans. Every human walking the planet today, regardless of race or nationality, traces their ancestral origins back to Africa. And African Americans, they are the direct inheritors of this genetic royalty. Although the transatlantic slave trade compressed this diversity, what made it through the bottleneck was still the most battle-hardened, adaptation-rich DNA in human history. Even after admixture, even after oppression, the African root remains dominant, and it carries with it strength, complexity, and variation unlike any other. This is why, from a purely scientific standpoint, studying African American DNA is like opening a treasure chest of evolutionary clues. It offers insights into disease resistance, metabolic efficiency, and even brain function. It helps scientists understand how we age, how we fight infections, and how we respond to drugs. And yet, for too long, this treasure was ignored, dismissed, or minimized by institutions more focused on European genetics. Beyond science, there is another area where identity has always been contested and hidden, and that is Scripture. Increasingly, many African Americans are turning not just to DNA tests, but to the Bible itself to ask a provocative question: are we in the book? Let's go back to Genesis 10, the Table of Nations. It lists the descendants of Noah's sons after the flood. Among them are Cush of Ethiopia, Mizraim of Egypt, Put of Libya, and Canaan of Palestine, names that are still tied to African and Middle Eastern geography today. These were the nations that would later form the kingdoms of Nubia, Aksum, Sheba, and Kemet, civilizations that scholars agree were dark-skinned, African in origin, and biblically recognized. But the deeper connection comes in Deuteronomy 28, where Moses delivers a chilling prophecy to the Israelites. If you disobey, you will be taken in ships to a land you do not know. You will serve your enemies, and no man shall redeem you. For centuries, this verse has haunted Black communities in the Americas. Ships, captivity, loss of identity. No redemption. Sound familiar? It's this parallel that has fueled a growing belief in churches, grassroots movements, and scholarly circles that African Americans are among the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Not metaphorically, but genetically and prophetically. The forced exile, the systematic erasure of heritage, and the resilience in the face of spiritual oppression all echo biblical exile stories, especially those of the ancient Hebrews. Even the Song of Solomon 1:5 says, "I am black and beautiful, O daughters of Jerusalem." Yet for centuries, this verse was translated and interpreted as a metaphor, stripped of its literal power. Why? Because to acknowledge a black presence in Scripture would mean acknowledging that black history and divine history are intertwined. This isn't just spiritual longing, it's scriptural logic, backed by ancient geography, linguistic clues, and oral traditions passed down through generations of African peoples. Some Ethiopian Jews, for instance, have practiced Jewish customs since before European Judaism took its modern form. The Lemba people of Zimbabwe and South Africa carry oral histories of a Hebrew priesthood and DNA markers linking them to the Levites, one of the ancient Israelite tribes. So what does all of this mean? It means that African American DNA may carry not just the strength of warriors and survivors, but the blood of prophets and priests. That the pain they carry may not be random. It may be part of a divine story long hidden and only now being reawakened. Whether or not you believe the full theological claim, one thing is undeniable. African Americans were cut off from their origin stories by force, by colonization, by design. But now, it's time to reclaim it. For centuries, slavery robbed African Americans of something deeper than land, language, or labor. It robbed them of their origin story. Forcibly removed from ancestral homelands, stripped of names, and severed from tribes, Black Americans were forced to start over without a map. But in the 21st century, a revolution is quietly underway. It's not happening in libraries or on battlefields. It's happening in spit tubes and cheek swabs. Through DNA testing, African Americans are finally beginning to reclaim what slavery tried to erase. Platforms like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, and especially AfricanAncestry.com have changed the game. They are allowing people of African descent to trace their lineage back to specific ethnic groups, regions, and even tribes across the continent. No longer confined to vague African labels, test results now point to the Mende of Sierra Leone, the Yoruba of Nigeria, or the Bamileke of Cameroon, names that echo with drums, stories, and stolen legacy. For many, this isn't just science, it's spiritual healing. To open a report and see the name of your ancestral tribe is to connect a broken chain, to reclaim a sense of belonging that was deliberately destroyed. It explains features, traditions, rhythms in the blood that never quite fit American narratives, but suddenly make sense when mapped to West Africa. This movement is more than personal, it's political. As African Americans reclaim their genome, they reclaim their power to define themselves, outside of colonial constructs like black, mulatto, or colored. They are rediscovering the royalty, the warriors, the griots, and the architects who came before the chains. They are bridging diasporas, reuniting with African relatives, and even using their results to travel back to their ancestral homelands, not as tourists, but as long-lost children returning home. And it's sparking cultural movements. From re-Africanization ceremonies to citizenship requests in Ghana and Sierra Leone, this genomic revolution is reshaping how identity is understood in the African diaspora. It's no longer just about skin color or struggle. It's about genealogy, geography, and glory. So, when someone asks, "Where are you from?" For the first time in centuries, an African American can say, "I know. And I can show you the map written in my DNA. What do you think?" Do African Americans have the most unique and diverse gene pool? Isn't it true that they are the most beautiful and genetically powerful like no other people? In the comment section below, let us know whether you are proud of your Black genes and the power they bring. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring videos on Black Africa, its history, rich arts and culture, and things the world should know about. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.